Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're tackling a really troubling situation involving HDCC Hyundai Development Company. You'll often hear them called HDC Hyundai.
Right.
You shared an article detailing, a recent legal setback for them, and it immediately raised some serious questions for us about safety standards. And, who's actually held accountable when things go so terribly wrong, especially in construction.
Exactly.
So our goal here is really to get to the heart of these events, try to understand the key issues, and figure out why this matters to you, someone who wants to be informed but maybe doesn't want to drown in details.
Yeah, absolutely. And the core of our discussion today is going to be that news article you sent over. It covers HDC Hyundai's recent appeal failure, sure, but it also lays out the history of these two really significant and tragic building collapses in Gwangju.
Two of them, yeah.
And critically, it points to some major concerns about their safety record and also their environmental, social, and governance ESG reporting.
Right, ESG. We'll definitely get into that.
Yeah.
The article, it highlights that HDC Hyundai just lost their appeal against a business suspension. This was initially put in place after the first collapse in Gwangju.
That's the one.
Okay, let's unpack this because this legal defeat really sets the stage, doesn't it, for a much bigger conversation about what happens after these kinds of disasters.
Yeah, the consequences.
And maybe most importantly, how companies and, individuals are held responsible at different levels.
Exactly. Who pays the price?
So let's start with the first major incident. This was back in June 2021. It was a demolition site for a redevelopment project in Gwangju. A building collapsed and tragically just engulfed a bus. 9 people lost their lives. Just horrific. What did the investigations actually find about HDC Hyundai's role?
Well, the investigations, they pointed towards significant negligence on HDC Hyundai's part. The article suggests they disregarded crucial safety protocols during that demolition.
Okay, so negligence was established.
Pretty clearly, it seems. But what's fascinating here and kind of concerning is that even with that finding, the initial penalties, I think it was an 8-month business suspension from the Seoul government.
Right.
Well, HDC Hyundai challenged it legally. They fought it. And those challenges basically stalled the suspension, delayed it, and ultimately it got reduced just to a financial fine.
Just a fine. After 9 people died.
Yeah. So despite that tragedy, the immediate sort of operational consequences for the company, pretty minimal, it looks like.
It's hard to fathom. And then, unbelievably, just months later.
Yeah, it wasn't long.
It happened again, January 2022. Another devastating collapse, also in Gwangju, this time at the Hwajeon I-Park construction site.
Right, the apartment complex.
This time, the upper floors of a building under construction, 39 floors, I think, just gave way.
Crumbled.
The article describes this chain reaction, wiped out 16 floors in total, and tragically 6 more people died, and 1 person was seriously injured.
Just off.
This second collapse, it really had to amplify the scrutiny on HDC Hyundai, didn't it? It makes you ask, what went so fundamentally wrong?
Yeah.
Were any lessons learned from that first disaster just months before?
It certainly begs that question, yeah. So, okay, let's fast forward a bit to April 2024. That's roughly 3 years after Hwajeon Park.
Okay.
That's when the initial court verdict came down for that incident. Now, some of the on-site people, managers and such, they did get prison sentences. The article mentions up to 4 years.
Right, some accountability on the ground.
Some. But, and this is the kicker, the 3 HDC Hyundai executives who were facing charges, they were actually acquitted.
Acquitted.
Yeah.
Completely.
Yeah.
Given the scale of it, the loss of life,
Yeah.
that seems... Well, how did the court justify that? What was the reasoning?
Well, the court's rationale, according to the article, was pretty narrowly focused. They looked at direct physical actions, things that could be directly pinned on those executives.
So, did they personally leave out a support beam or something?
Exactly. They essentially said they couldn't find enough proof that the executives themselves were directly responsible for the specific physical acts causing the collapse. The court didn't really seem to tackle the bigger picture stuff, like the decision-making processes in the company or, failures in the overall safety systems they might have overseen.
So no systemic failure considered at that level?
It appears not in that judgment. And this outcome, as you can imagine, sparked huge outrage from the victims' families. They felt it was way too lenient.
I can only imagine.
And it really highlighted this gap, didn't it, between accountability for the folks doing the work on site and accountability for the people in the executive suites.
Yeah, it really does. It feels like the people carrying out the orders face consequences, but maybe not those setting the tone or the priorities from the top.
Precisely. For someone trying to understand this, the court really focused on that direct causation. Did Executive A do action B that immediately caused the collapse? Not did their policies or lack of oversight contribute to an environment where collapse was possible? That narrow focus is often a sticking point in these corporate negligence cases.
Absolutely. It creates that disconnect. Now, the article also talks about the leadership's response. HDC Group Chairman Gwangju. After the Hwajeong iPark disaster, he announced his resignation.
Yes, big press conference. Said he'd take responsibility.
Okay, but here's the interesting part, right? He resigned as HDC Hyundsan chairman, the construction company itself.
Correct.
But he kept his chairmanship of the parent company, the holding company, HDC.
That's the crucial bit, yes.
So he stepped down from the bit directly involved in the collapse, but he still controls the whole group overall.
Seems like it. He maintained overall control.
So how much real change does that signal? If he still holds the reins at the top level, is that genuine accountability, or is it more about optics, managing the fallout?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Stepping down from HDC Hyundsan looks like taking responsibility, but staying on at the holding company, it means he still has huge influence, huge control over the whole organization.
Right.
So, yeah, it definitely raises serious doubts. Was it a true acceptance of responsibility for, systemic failures? Or maybe more of a symbolic gesture to try and limit the reputational damage?
It makes you wonder.
If you look at corporate governance, it often comes down to where that ultimate decision-making power really sits. So for you, trying to get your head around how these things work, this kind of move really shows the complexity, right? Where the real power is, even when someone seems to be stepping aside.
It certainly does. Okay, so moving on, the article then hits some pretty damning points about HDC Hyundsan's safety culture, or maybe the lack of one.
Yeah, this is pretty stark.
Apparently, before that first collapse in Gwangju in 2021, the company reportedly didn't even have a dedicated safety and health committee.
No committee. It's basic stuff.
And get this, they provided no formal safety training. Not for their own employees, not even for the workers at their partner companies.
Nothing.
That just sounds like a fundamental, almost inexcusable failure in basic safety management. How is that even possible for a company that size?
It absolutely sounds like it. And the article strongly implies that this lack of a basic safety system likely played a big role in why these tragedies happened and happened again.
You'd think.
But what's particularly striking, maybe even bizarre, is the contrast between this apparent void in safety culture and their ESG rating.
Yes, the ESG ratings. Environmental, social governance.
Exactly. Despite this history, despite these two major fatal collapses, HDC Hyundsan has actually scored relatively high on ESG metrics.
High? How high?
Well, the article mentions an A grade in governance, specifically from the Korea Institute of Corporate Governance and ESG KCGS.
An A in governance. For a company with this track record, that feels deeply contradictory. How does the article explain that? How can a company involved in such clear, tragic safety failures get strong ESG marks?
Well, that's the thing. This situation really throws a spotlight on potential flaws in how ESG is sometimes measured, doesn't it?
It certainly seems to.
It suggests that maybe the current metrics don't always capture or prioritize fundamental safety records adequately. Maybe companies with really serious failures can still somehow look okay on paper.
So the reporting itself might be the issue.
The article points out that HDC Hyundsan's own ESG reports seem to focus on, well, maybe more superficial metrics.
Like what?
They highlight things like a reduction in high-risk accident rates, which sounds pretty hollow given the collapses, right?
Extremely hollow.
And they talk about increased investments in safety measures. But crucially, they seem to downplay or completely ignore the actual collapses, the deaths, in their reporting.
So they're cherry-picking the data.
It certainly looks that way. They present a positive image by focusing on certain things while basically glossing over the huge negative events. And this really does raise big questions about the true value, the reliability of some ESG ratings if they don't fully account for such critical failures like, people dying.
It really does. It makes you question the whole point if it
Absolutely.
doesn't reflect something as fundamental as keeping people safe.
Oh.
Okay, so despite all this, the horrific events, the legal issues, the safety questions, the article says HDC Hyundsan's business largely carried on.
Yeah, without significant disruption, it seems.
They've even secured major new reconstruction contracts. which frankly is kind of astonishing.
It is surprising on the surface.
And then you look at their finances. First quarter of 2025,
Mm-hmm.
sales were down a little, maybe 5% compared to the year before.
Okay.
But their operating profit, it shot up, almost 30% increase.
Wow, a 30% jump in profit.
Yeah. And the article attributes that to strong performance in their own housing projects, like specific developments in Seoul and Suwon. So, the picture we get is a company responsible for these terrible safety failures, 15 deaths in total. But financially, they seem to be weathering it pretty well. What does that tell us about the industry itself?
Well, it paints a pretty concerning picture of the industry dynamics, doesn't it? The fact that a company can have these severe safety failures leading to such tragic loss of life and still win major contracts, still see profit growth, it suggests that maybe the consequences aren't hitting hard enough financially or reputationally in the long run.
Not enough to force fundamental change, perhaps?
Exactly. It could indicate a system where maybe safety isn't prioritized as intensely as it should be because the penalties just aren't strong enough to really alter how businesses operate day to day.
The article even includes a quote from someone inside the construction industry that really crystallizes this point.
Oh, yeah, that quote was chilling.
They say, and I'm quoting here, "Accidents are temporary, orders continue."
Oof.
Suggesting this isn't just a one-off, it's a pattern, a systemic issue, where the real burden, the real consequences fall on the workers, on the public.
While the company recovers.
Right, while corporate accountability and sort of image repair can be quite superficial, that's a pretty damning view of the whole sector.
It is, and that quote really makes you pause, suggesting it's potentially a deep-rooted problem, not just about this one company.
So how does the article wrap this all up?
Well, it concludes by really hammering home that stark disconnect between HDC's own ESG slogan, something like, "We create affluent lives and a trustworthy world,"
Right, I remember reading that.
and the grim reality of these two fatal collapses. It emphasizes that real responsibility isn't about, finding legal loopholes or just managing PR.
It's about genuine change.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging mistakes truly and fundamentally changing the organization, the culture, especially around safety.
Did HDC Hunsan comment for the article? Especially after losing that recent appeal.
Nope. The article specifically mentions they didn't respond to requests for comment about their safety measures or their future plans.
Silence again. Speaks volumes, doesn't it?
It really does seem to fit the pattern, suggesting perhaps a reluctance to engage directly on accountability.
Okay, so let's quickly recap. We've looked at HDC Hyunsan and these two devastating building collapses in Gwangju, 15 lives lost, tragically. We explored the legal battles, the acquittal of the top executives, while some site managers got sentences, raising serious questions about accountability at different levels.
And the safety culture or apparent lack thereof before the incidents.
Right. And then the bizarre situation with the high ESG ratings, despite this record.
Contradictory, yeah.
And the fact that business-wise, they seem to be doing okay, even growing profits despite everything.
Yeah, continuing to secure contracts and perform well financially.
And for you, listening in, someone who wants to grasp these important stories without getting swamped, hopefully this deep dive has given you a clearer picture of this really complex situation.
Yeah, we've tried to pull out the critical issues, safety, accountability, corporate responsibility, and construction, without burying you in jargon or endless detail.
So considering all of this, it really leaves us with a pretty crucial question, I think. In an industry where apparently huge safety failures like this can happen, without necessarily leading to massive long-term consequences for the company leadership or its overall success, well, what are the real incentives to truly prioritize safety?
That's the core issue, isn't it? What really drives safety improvement?
And what mechanisms can actually ensure genuine accountability, not just symbolic gestures, but real accountability to prevent these kinds of tragedies from happening again?
It's a tough question with no easy answers.
Definitely a sobering thought, and certainly something worth mulling over as you navigate the news and think about the systems, corporate, legal, regulatory, that shape the world around us.